so I'm going to record. Okay, now we're recording. So we're starting on page 44. Sorry for the late recording for those who catch up. But we're talking about Jacob's favorite is Joseph, and he makes him a long robe with sleeves. Not a coat of many colors, but a long robe with sleeves. And this was a sign of Jacob's affection for Joseph. Something like this would have cost a little more, in terms of materials and certainly more skill required to make something like that. I'm not a seamstress, but I know how to sew a button, and sewing a button is hard enough that making something with sleeves is just, I can imagine that it would be difficult. But we see that this favoritism that Joseph receives causes strife between Joseph and some of his brothers. Strife that Joseph is just going to kind of agitate. What we see here, in that same paragraph, it says, "But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his other brothers, because of this coat, this tunic, they hated him and could not speak peaceably with him." The Jewish translation says they hated him so that they could not speak a friendly word to him. And literally, this is talking about they could not give him shalom, peace. Remember, we say in church, the peace of the Lord be always with you, right? That's the formal greeting. Well, that comes from our Jewish brothers and sisters, that word shalom. It's a formal greeting, and it's also a state of being, right? To be at peace with one another. And his brothers, they could not even say shalom to him. When the peace came at the Eucharist, they went to the other side of the church. Couldn't talk to him. So Joseph then makes matters a little worse, because he goes to them and he says, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed." He says, "There we were binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed going to reign over us?" And this, they're offended by this, right? Because Joseph's pretty low in the pecking order in terms of birth order. He's one of the younger ones. And particularly the children of Leah, Jacob's first wife, are offended here. And they, in a sense, put the children of Rachel in with the same category as the children of Zilpah and Bilhah, the second class sons, right? We're going to tolerate you, but you have your place, and you just need to don't rock the boat, right? Don't rock the boat. So they hated him more, it says, because of his dreams. We then the path takes a break because we have a repetition in the narrative. It's a second dream that Joseph has. And I'm just going to read it from this Jewish translation. "Look, I have had another dream." He's telling it to his brothers. "This time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." And when he told it to his father and brothers, his father berated him, saying, "What is this dream you have dreamed? Are we to come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow low to you to the ground?" So now it's not only the brothers that are bowing to Jacob, but it's also to Joseph, but it's also Joseph's father and mother, which is interesting because Rachel at this point is dead. She's dead. But that's still the dream, right? That the family is sort of doing honor to Joseph. But what's interesting is that the family immediately interprets this with the worst lenses on, right? They immediately say, "Well, you're going to have dominion over us." And instead, what they miss is this sort of agriculture metaphor, agriculture connection here, the sheaves, right, the connection, and then the sun and the moon and the stars governing the seasons, right? This is connected to our agriculture. And of course, as we see later in the story, it is this connection to agriculture, it's food, right? Joseph's able to save them from famine. And that's how the dream is played out. But of course, they don't see that connection up front. They don't see it. So there's some resistance here. There's a little bit of hatred building up, a little bit of enmity building up. They weren't at peace before. Now they're really not at peace. This Jewish commentary talks about how it says, Joseph telling his brothers the dream evidences Joseph's immaturity and lack of foresight. Joseph's immaturity. Joseph's a young man at this point, right? He's kind of brazen. He has this dream, and you can imagine he might be puffing out his chest a little bit, you know. Y'all never believe what you're going to do in just a few years' time. I'm going to be in charge over y'all. So there's a little bit of pride involved here. Joseph, as a young man, doesn't have much foresight and prudence. But as the story continues, we see that Joseph learns from that and does exercise prudence and foresight. And in fact, the thing we remember Joseph for is his prudence and foresight in managing the coming famine in Egypt, right, on Pharaoh's behalf. So Joseph does grow as we go, but he's a little bit like his father here. You know, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Just as Jacob was kind of a proud man, Joseph is kind of a proud man. Yeah. So this is the setup, right? Genesis is setting up the conflict. And then, of course, we get to the actual, the problem, right? The problem. Before we get there, though, I do want to talk a little bit about dreams. We saw a dream with Jacob, right? The dream at Bethel. Bethel meaning the house of God, where the angels were ascending and descending. And now here in this story of Joseph, we see dreams becoming more and more important. And whereas God communicated with Abraham in a very direct way, even visiting Abraham, right? And of course, the angel visits Jacob. Here, God is choosing to communicate with Joseph a little differently. We don't see a direct visitation in the same way, but we do have these dreams, and God gives Joseph the wisdom and discernment to interpret the dreams. So God comes and visits us in different ways. God speaks to us in different ways. I think we all know that even now in our own lives, right? You ask people, how does God speak to you? And you might get different answers, right? God comes to us in different ways. So I just think that's an interesting note. Anything about the dreams that stuck out to you, that that caught your attention or surprised you? Maybe something you hadn't seen before. These are very familiar stories, but anything like that. We'll just move on then. Again, I want to hear what you have to say. I want to hear your thoughts. And of course, the main action's about to come, right? That was all just the setup. The path on page 45 says, one day Joseph's brothers were out in a field pasturing their father's flock. Jacob sent Joseph out to find them. I do want to fill in a little bit here because it comes around at the end of the story. The brothers are in the pasture and Joseph is at home. And to me, this reminds me of the Jacob story where Esau's out and he's the one who goes out and does the hunting and goes out into the wilderness, and Jacob stays home, right? He's a sort of a homebody. Joseph's the same way, right? And that makes sense because he's his father's favorite. So he tells Jacob tells Joseph, "I want you to go check on your brothers because they're at Shechem. Your brothers are pasturing at Shechem. Come, I will send you to them." He answered, "I am ready." Um, the note here, this "I am ready," just the way the Hebrew plays out, it's a sort of a foreshadowing of some loss. I don't quite understand that, but that's what the rabbis say. So if we could read Hebrew, we would all sort of be gasping, I guess. I don't know. So he says, "Go and see how they are. Go and see how your brothers are." And literally, this is go and see the shalom of your brothers. Remember, there's no shalom. There's no peace between Joseph and his brothers. Jacob's either ignorant of that or choosing to ignore it. So he's saying, go see how they are. Go see their shalom. I would say Jacob's probably just ignoring it here. He's just acting like there's not a problem. So this is where the path picks up. Joseph went out to his brothers and he found them at Dothan. Dothan, however you want to say it. Dothan's probably easy. Now he goes to Shechem and they're not there. Interestingly, Joseph will go to Shechem one more time when he's dead. He will be buried in Shechem. But that's the last. That's the next time Shechem shows up. But they see him coming from a distance, and they said, "Here comes this dreamer." Which I kind of like that phrase. Here comes this dreamer. They're taking this attribute of Joseph. They're being sarcastic, and aren't brothers like that? I grew up with a brother. I don't know if y'all did, but here comes this dreamer. "Let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." So they're saying, let's just go ahead and nip this in the butt right now, and we'll see what happens. But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Now, this is important. The characters are important here. Reuben is the oldest son of Jacob. He's the firstborn. He and traditionally, right, he would stand to inherit. Reuben is going to become an important character throughout the Joseph story. He speaks up, but what we're going to see at the end is Joseph takes Reuben's place. Joseph gets that double blessing that would normally be reserved for the firstborn. So he delivers him. They throw him into the pit. They, take his garment and they make it look bloody, and there's no water in it. So then they sit down to eat. This, again, the story here, every word is important. They sit down to a meal, the Jewish Bible says, and Joseph is in the pit. And to me, this reminds me of some of the letters of St. Paul about going to communion, going to the feast with enmity in your heart against your brother. It reminds me of Jesus's admonition that if we are on our way to the altar and we realize we're at war in our hearts with our brother or sister, leave our gift at the altar and go make peace, right? They're sitting down to a meal without peace. There's no shalom. And if we put a Eucharistic lens on this, think about the Eucharist, Holy Communion. That's a big no-no, right? We don't go to the Eucharist without peace in our hearts. If we have problems with our neighbor, we go make up with our neighbor first, because St. Paul says if we go to the Eucharist unworthily, without shalom, that peace, we eat and drink to our own condemnation. So they sat down to eat and forget Joseph. Yeah, Sarah, yeah, pipe up. I think you're muted. Yeah, there you
Yes. I wonder if you could tell us that scripture kind of, and don't you have a more literal translation? It's a New Testament, so it wouldn't be Old Testament, but the Matthew, or is it Matthew? No, the one about if your brother has aught against you. Yes, it's Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah,
Can you
I don't.
tell us that in a better version or more literal
Yeah,
translation?
yeah. I just have my Old Testament with me.
Okay. No, we can go look at it later. I'm just
Yeah,
curious
no,
about
that'd be something
because
good to.
because but one of the things that I read, it said if you're in maybe even King James, if your brother has something against you, and that doesn't necessarily mean you did something, but he
Right.
perceives that you've done something, and that's what I was curious about. Yeah, that's a big responsibility. That's more so than we're just mad at each other, but
Yeah.
maybe I'm not even wrong, but I have to go make it right.
Yeah.
That's all. I was curious about the
Yeah.
translation.
I mean, that's how I remember it, and I'll look up that translation. That's how I remember it too. And so, if we're applying that to this story of Joseph and his brothers, it's not just that the brothers have hatred in their heart and Joseph washes his hands and says, I don't know what to do about that, right? Joseph ought to have gone to his brothers and tried to make peace. Um, Now, maybe nothing happens because of that, but instead, what you get is Joseph sort of, he lacks some graciousness early in the story. Um, he's not taking that step to reconcile to his brothers, even though he had to have known that there's this rift, you know. And I think that's a good lesson for all of us too. Sometimes people are just mad at us and we didn't do anything, but you know, have the courage and the grace to be proactive and go to them and say, hey, let's work this out. Let's talk about it. And maybe you don't work it out and you're not best friends, but at least you have some peace with one another, right? um, as St. Paul says in Romans 12, as much as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Go that extra mile to try to make peace. Do your part, even if it's not your fault. Thank you for that, Sarah. So they're eating. The brothers are eating. And they see a caravan coming, and they get the idea. Let's send them off to Egypt, right? Let's sell them into slavery. And this is Judah, one of the brothers, is saying, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. So you have Reuben and Judah, who are the two important brothers. Judah will become the main tribe in the south. Jesus comes from Joseph, right? It's from the tribe of Judah. Jesus, therefore, is a descendant of the tribe of Judah. David, right? The tribe of Judah becomes very important. And they all point back to this moment and see here, Judah did what was right, at least to some degree. And as the story goes, Judah, does the right thing. As we'll see. So they sell him off into Egypt land. So I'm gonna resist the temptation to go over the story in detail, but we know that Joseph goes to Potiphar's house. Potiphar is high up in Egyptian administration, right? Joseph, even though a slave, over and over, right? Joseph's in the pit, and God shows favor. Joseph's a slave in Potiphar's house, and God shows favor, and Joseph's in charge. Joseph's in prison and God shows favor and the jailer puts him in charge of things, right? So over and over, even in the worst moments of Joseph's life, God is lifting Joseph up into these positions of prominence. And of course, Joseph is thrown into jail because of Potiphar's wife's false accusation against him that obviously she says Joseph was a good looking man, so she wants to lay with Joseph, and he runs away, and she has his garment. Again, that garment. Joseph's clothes change all the time in this story. His clothes change 5 different times, because what he's wearing says something about his status, right? So his garment is taken from him again, um, and Potiphar has him thrown into prison. Jewish midrash, which is again the rabbis riffing on these stories, finds it difficult to believe that Joseph is completely innocent here. One midrash says, likens Joseph to one who would stand in the marketplace, put makeup around his eyes, straighten up his hair, and swing his heels. That's probably an old midrash, because that sounds pretty ridiculous to me. But Mrs. Potiphar's proposition was thus a punishment for his narcissism, one rabbi says. So Joseph's, just like early on in the story, Joseph's kind of got this machismo, this better than that. He's still got a little bit of that. Go ahead, Sarah.
One thing someone taught us in a Bible study one time was that Joseph was still very prideful.
Yeah.
And we see that when he's in jail and he says to the guy, he says, remember me to Pharaoh. He's still thinking about himself. He's still saying, please, you think about me too, and have Pharaoh think about me. And of course, the guy forgets him for 2 years. And
Right.
Somebody was saying that's really, God's still trying to help Joseph deal with his pride.
Yeah,
So,
he's incredibly prideful. That
would make sense with Potiphar's wife, that he might have been very enjoying the adoration, maybe not succumbing to the temptation, but enjoying being adored.
Yeah, and I think that's why the rabbis probably, say that, right? Because there are other things in Joseph's story where his pride comes out, this sense of, better than thou, look at me, I'm great. That's his besetting sin. And, we all have besetting sins. We just do. And pride's usually at the root of mine, at least. Most of ours, I would say the root is pride. The root of most sins is pride. Lifting up ourselves higher than maybe we ought. Or the converse of that, which is also a form of pride, false humility. Putting ourselves down lower than we ought. In both senses, not seeing our true value in God's eyes. But Joseph will learn. So in prison, we get another dream story. We have the cupbearer and the baker. They have these dreams. Joseph interprets them, saying, the cupbearer is going to be restored. The baker is going to be impaled. And that is indeed what happens. And as Sarah mentioned, this is on the end of chapter 40. Joseph asks, let's see, where's that verse? Joseph asks to be remembered. Do me the kindness of mentioning me to Pharaoh so as to free me from this place, right? As if Pharaoh's going to care, first of all. But, still thinking about himself, how, and in a certain sense, I can't blame him, being in the dungeon. An interesting Hebrew thing, the word for pit and dungeon is the same in Hebrew. So Joseph is in the pit. His brothers throw him in the pit. He's now in the pit again, right? So repeating. The end of chapter 40 says, the chief cupbearer did not think of Joseph. He forgot him. So Joseph's left in the pit, in the dungeon for a while longer, to do a little more penance, maybe. Let God work on him a little bit. So then we have the Pharaoh dream. And this is on page 46, chapter 41 of Genesis. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. When he had shaved himself and changed his clothes yet again, changing of the clothes, the sign of a changing of one's station, he came in before Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells him that he's had these two dreams back to back, just as Joseph had two dreams back to back. Good Lord. Had two dreams back to back that mean the same thing, right? They're the same dream, just played out a little differently. The long and short of it is there's going to be 7 good years, 7 bad years. So you need to prepare for the bad years now. What's interesting is that we see that Joseph has already grown. And this is, again, midway through 46. Pharaoh says to Joseph, I have had a dream. There is none who can interpret it, meaning his own magicians, his own wise men, that sort of thing. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. But Joseph answers Pharaoh, it is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. We haven't seen that yet. I mean, we see it in the pit, right? We see him talk, but Joseph has now learned that it's God's providence, it's God's gift that is giving him this. So Joseph recognizes it as a gift, but he's aware that it comes from God. So God's working on Joseph's heart of it. This is not the same young man that stood up in front of his brothers and said, all y'all are going to bow down to me one day. You know, Joseph is, God's changed his heart a little bit. But what's interesting is that it's not an immediate conversion. It happens over time, right? Jacob, you might say, has this immediate conversion, perhaps, you know, wrestling with the angel. But for Joseph, it takes a long time, and God works on his heart little by little by little through the ups and downs of his life to bring Joseph where he is at this point. And, you know, that's how God is with all of us, I think. God converts our hearts little by little, changes us little by little. Yeah. So Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of all the land, makes Joseph his sort of right-hand man, on the advice of Pharaoh, or on the advice of Joseph, right? Joseph is clothed again, right? And this time with garments of royal authority. Garments of royal authority. So I want to stop there and see what thoughts you might have. As you were reading that, what you were thinking of, maybe you resonate with Joseph's sort of journey, sort of in the pit and then out of the pit, in the pit and out of the pit, and how God sees us through all of that. This might be a question for us to consider. Joseph had a lot of ups and downs, but God is present with him through it all. So how do we see God present in the ups and downs of our lives? I think it's a question we can all sort of sit with and think about it, you know, not just tonight, but going forward. But are there any thoughts on that, how God is present with us through the ups and downs of our lives, and when we're in the pit or when we're out of the pit?
Yes, we need to be aware of that, especially in times of trouble and in good times also.
Yeah, it's not, God doesn't just show up when we're in the pit, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's when we call upon him, but we need to think about him in the good times too.
Right. Yeah. And
Be thankful.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. And that's that can be a challenge sometimes, because like Joseph, we can have this sin of pride, particularly in good times. Like everything is going great. Look how wonderful I am doing right now, whatever it is. Um, and that's our pride speaking, right? We fail to realize that everything we have is a gift from God, and so whether in good times or bad times, it's all from God. It's all a gift from God. So to be thankful for that. Um, yeah. So we see on page 48 that Joseph's prediction comes true. We should say God's prediction through Joseph comes through, right? Joseph, in interpreting the dream, was listening to God. And so there is a famine, 7 good years followed by 7 bad years, and Joseph's the one in charge of allocating the resources to get the people through the famine. And this is a famine that's bigger than just Egypt, right? It's a regional thing, and so Jacob sends his remaining sons, to Egypt to get some food. It's like, hey, I hear you can get some food over there. Why don't y'all? Jacob has a big family, so it takes a bit to feed everyone. So they go, and his brothers, it turns out, appear before Joseph, and of course they don't recognize Joseph. They don't recognize Joseph in his new station. Perhaps they weren't looking for Joseph, right? They've written Joseph off long ago. So, and this is the italicized portion bit, but they bowed down low before him, just as Joseph had imagined in his dream so many years ago. Joseph knows his brothers immediately, but he pretends not to know them. He tells the guards that they are spies, and had them thrown into jail. Then, they visit a couple times. This is a very simplified version of the story, but I guess they visit once, and they visit once without Benjamin. He asks about the father, he asks about brothers, and he says, well, if you ever have to come back, you have to bring Benjamin with you. Benjamin's Joseph's brother, right? And so his actual brother, by Rachel. And so they convince the father, Jacob, to allow them to bring Benjamin. Joseph's almost overcome, right? Has a feast for him. Regardless, there's issue with the silver chalice, and I really want to get into all that, but we just don't have time. The point is, Joseph here is testing his brothers in a way. He wants to know if these are the same fellas that threw him into the pit. Are they going to throw him into the pit again? Yeah, and it's in a metaphorical sense, right? Or like him, have they grown? This is a testing of them, and they pass the test. Particularly Judah passes the test, and the silver cup is snuck into Benjamin's sack, and so they are arrested. Right, you're stealing stuff from Joseph, and Joseph pretends as if he's going to throw Benjamin into prison. Judah steps in and says, not me, but him, right? So they have changed, Joseph sees. And where the narrative picks up here is Joseph revealing himself to his brothers. This is at the bottom of page 48. Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. I think that's interesting. So dismayed were they at his presence. Here in Joseph, they're being confronted with that most evil deed they've done, right? The selling of their brother. When they take the coat to Jacob, they don't tell Jacob that Joseph's died, right? They deliberately don't lie to Jacob. They let Jacob get to that conclusion, and so they torment their father forever. And so here in this moment, they're confronted with that sin, and so they're dismayed. But they do reconcile, right? And this is on page 49. I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. So Joseph here in hindsight, sees the providence of God at work, sees the hand of God at work in all these events in a way that his brothers could not have anticipated, nor Joseph, right? But sees the providence of God at work. And makes me think of the times in my life when things have not worked out like I thought they ought to. And yet in hindsight, it's always in hindsight. In hindsight, you see, oh, God was at work in that moment. I thought everything was lost, but look what God brought out of it. And that's what we call divine providence, the will of God working God's will in the world. And so then they're all brought to Egypt. There's a reconciliation. Did you try to say something, Burton? Okay. All right. I didn't want to cut you off. I just think this is a very beautiful scene. But the reconciliation here is not total. We will see after Jacob dies, the brothers go to Joseph worried that Joseph, now that Jacob is dead, that Joseph's going to hold it over their heads. So we're skipping ahead a little bit, but this is the top of page 50. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" They do recognize the wrong, so that's good. So they approached Joseph saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crimes of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crimes of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. So for the brothers, and oftentimes when we're in the wrong, when we've done something wrong to another, and even if that other person forgives us, we have a hard time forgiving ourselves, of accepting that forgiveness, right? Again, that's the sin of pride, not accepting forgiveness as a gift from God and from others. And I think Joseph's brothers are there too. Reconciliation after a wrong is a process. Healing is a process. It does not happen overnight. It's like any wound. It takes time to heal, and Joseph's brothers are still working through that healing, it seems, and are worried. But how does Joseph respond? He responds in much of the same way that he responded the first time. He said, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? In other words, I've forgiven you. I'm not God. That's under the bridge for me. If God judges you, God judges you, but I've forgiven you. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. In that, in part, I hear the blessing that God gives Abraham that's been passed down. You know, that Abraham was to be a channel of blessing for peoples, for the nations. Joseph here is living into that promise. Joseph's part of that way in which Abraham's descendants are being a blessing to everyone. But Joseph says to his brothers that God used for good what they had intended for harm. And this is one of the discussion questions. What does this tell us about how God works in Joseph's life and how God works in our own lives? I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about that. You intended it for harm, but God meant it for good. Does that resonate with anyone's personal life at all? Something that's happened, perhaps? Something good brought out of something bad? Y'all are a tough crowd. Well, just think about that, you know. And again, this is something we always see in hindsight, really, right? Joseph here, you know, Joseph in the pit is not saying, well, you intended it for harm, but God will mean it for good. You know, Joseph's not saying that. This is hindsight. But I think the response of faith is, even when we're in the pit, to say, golly, I don't see how God's going to bring any good out of this, but God will. You know, having that faith that even if we don't see in the moment how anything good can come out of this bad situation, having the faith to know that that's what God does. God brings good out of bad. God redeems the bad and brings something good out of it. I mean, think about Jesus on the cross, right? This instrument of torture and death becomes for us the means to eternal life. What do you think, Burton?
God kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden for their redemption.
Right.
If everything just goes along great, hunky dory, we're probably going to get prideful and think, hey, this isn't all of us, and we don't need anybody, especially God, looking over us. And it's troubles that can bring us closer to God.
Yeah.
You know, you can land in the ditch.
Yeah. I would say troubles will bring us closer to God if we let them. We have a choice.
Yeah, you can land in the ditch face down and drown, or you can land face up.
Yeah.
And go to God.
Yeah, that's a good. I think that's a good image, right? You're in the ditch, nonetheless. But once you're in the ditch, I do think we have the capacity to say, okay, am I going to despair? And sometimes that's a real temptation, right? And a completely understandable thing, right? I sometimes that's understandable. Or are we willing to sort of look to God, and even in that moment of despair, sort of have a stubborn faith that says, I don't know how God's going to work this out, but God's gonna. And that doesn't mean everything's going to be perfect at the end of the day, but God's going to work to bring something good out of this. And it might be a long time before we see it. But, you know, having faith that one day we can know, right? I mean, Joseph's story, it's years before God brings Joseph to where God really needs him, right? I do want to spend the last couple minutes. Go ahead, Burton.
Oh, we've all heard of wallowing in despair. Well, the ditch is a good example of that. You know, it's a low place with
Yeah.
water.
A slough. You know, when I got to Stuttgart, I didn't know what the word slough was, and
You were in it.
well, I've never been in a slough, thank goodness. You know, I'd be driving to Little Rock and think, what is that word? Slow, slough. Never guessed slough. Rick Hampton had to tell me how to pronounce that word. So that's just an aside. Okay. Jacob does die. Jacob dies and blesses his sons. Remember, Jacob breaks tradition here, and he just blesses everyone, blesses all his sons. Now, Joseph, he also blesses Manasseh and Ephraim, who are Joseph's sons. Joseph, when he became the right-hand man of the Pharaoh, was married to the daughter of a priest in Egypt. And so I think here Jacob is adopting those grandchildren as a way to say, you're in the covenant, right? Even though there's this, Jacob or Joseph technically married outside the family, married outside the clan, Jacob is bringing them in. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but chapter 49 of Genesis, if you want to read that, is Jacob's blessings for all his sons. And these sons become the tribes of Israel, right? The fathers of the tribes of Israel. I do want to spend some time on Judah, though, because Judah, as I said, becomes important. Remember, Judah's the one who says, let's not kill him, let's sell him into slavery. Judah's the one who says, take me, not Benjamin. Judah becomes a leader among his brothers and will become the main tribe in the south. Reuben, even though he's the oldest, is sort of displaced by Joseph's children. Ephraim and Manasseh become the main tribes in the north. And you have to fast forward through the Bible to see how all that plays out. We don't have time, but that's just trivia. This is chapter 49, verse 8. You, O Judah, your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the nape of your foes. Your father's sons shall bow low to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. On prey, my son, have you grown. He crouches, lies down like a lion, like the king of beasts. Who dare rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, so that tribute shall come to him, and the homage of peoples be his. He tethers his ass to a vine, his ass's foal to a choice vine. He washes his garment in wine, his robe in blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, his teeth are whiter than milk. So this is the longest blessing that Jacob gives to one of his sons. And in this, we see a seed of messianic hope. And as we see Jesus in this blessing, if we look, right? Jesus, as I said, comes from the tribe of Judah, like David, right? So that's why he's called a son of David, the same tribe. But he tethers his ass to a vine. Remember when Jesus goes into Jerusalem, he's not riding on a mighty stallion, right? As a military hero. What's he riding on? A donkey, right? He's riding on a donkey. This donkey is a sign, can be a sign of peace. It's a sign of confidence, I think, that for this Messiah figure that's promised, for this Messiah that's being promised all the way back here, God wages wars on his behalf, right? So this is not some sort of Charlemagne, figure. Jesus sort of riding in Jerusalem on a stallion, but rather coming on a lowly donkey, and God doing the work of redemption through Christ. So I encourage you to read chapter 49. It's really beautiful. It's some fun language. Verse 22, Joseph is a wild ass, which a wild ass by a spring. And this time that's a compliment. I wouldn't encourage you to bless your own children in that way. But in this time, a major compliment. Donkeys seen as independent, vigorous creatures. Joseph will die. He is embalmed according to the custom of the Egyptians. And as we will see, when the Israelites leave for the promised land, they take Joseph with them. So he does not stay in Egypt. He's taken to the promised land and buried at Shechem, where he was supposed to go all those years ago to find his brothers. He's finally buried there in peace. Hey, it's 7:00 on the dot. I did it one week. Are there any thoughts? Y'all make me talk way too much. I don't like it. Joseph's story is incredibly important, this is sort of the end of the, you might call the patriarch story, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Starting next week, we're in Exodus with the story of Moses. So change into a different book. But these foundational stories in Genesis are so important, and I think it's important that we know them. And there's a lot there that we didn't cover. So if you're ever reading Genesis and you come across a weird story, you want to talk about it, you know where my office is at. So next week is Moses. Up through the plagues, and I think we can get through Moses up through the plagues in Egypt, and stopping there. So not quite at the Exodus, because that's the next chapter. But yeah. Thoughts, comments? This is fun, y'all.
Yes.
Well, I will see you all next week, and look forward to discussing. I will say, The Prince of Egypt is a fun movie. So it's that old Disney movie. So if you have time to watch The Prince of Egypt this week and they need something light, why not watch that? Anyway, that's me. But I will see you all soon. I hope y'all take care. God bless y'all.
Thank you.
Good to see y'all.
See y'all.
Bye.